All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming out tonight, taking some time to come over here and listen to me talk. Tonight we're going to go through a few different things as far as routine maintenance and every day on your bike. It can be a pretty complex thing. There's a lot of different things on your bike that can go wrong, make noises, and things that can slow you down basically while you're riding or cause things not to shift right. And it's kind of a bit of a problem-solving action and reaction type thing on what makes it do what. First thing we're going to get into is overall is the cleaning of the bike. Let's see here. So as far as how clean you keep your bike or how often that you need to clean it, all is based off of where you ride, how often you ride, and the conditions that you're riding in. Obviously, if you're riding in a muddy, dirty mountain bike type thing, you want to clean your bike a little bit more often. You can imagine the grit and grime and everything that gets down the bearings, and it just causes more wear on it than someone that's out on clean roads or riding on a smooth paved path all the time. So starting off, this is kind of the things that you need on an everyday basis while you're cleaning your bike. Some sort of stand. A lot of people just have something they prop it up. I've seen people more or less wedge their back tire in between the door frame and the door and hold their bike up and hold it steady. You can't beat a nice stand and bring them up to your level while you're working on it. Rags. You've got, I usually keep two different rags around, one for actually working on wheelie stuff, getting the chains and stuff, and then anything that's got grease on it. And then a polish rag for whenever you're actually going into final cleaning on everything. Kind of a soap or a degreaser. This is a pretty good degreaser, but it's also chemical free, so it's bio-friendly. But it gets in there. The degreaser is mainly used getting around the pivot points around your chain. And it can get some, if you have any kind of grease debris from the chain, between wax or excess lube, it typically builds up around the chain area and around the bottom bracket. It helps cut through that, something that a simple rag and a polish can't always get off. Brushes, there's a lot of different types for getting in different places. You've got some brushes here for getting around the tires. You just want to be careful not to use too deep of or firm of a bristle brush. If you were to take this and rub it on your frame, it can cause scratches. And then you've got small, well, let's see if I have one. I think I have one out of a package up here somewhere. These are show. Basically a little toothbrush, more or less. This gets in between the cogs, and it actually has a knurled edge that you can really, if you have anything, any sticks wedged in places, you can get that in there. And then the polish. This after you get done with the cleaning, you spray it on. Most of your polishes are Teflon based, so once you wipe it on there, you can actually spray. Once you get it on there, it has a buildup that it puts on there. You can wipe it down, and it almost works as a wax. You go back and buff it afterwards, and it puts a polish on there that dirt doesn't stick to. So after you clean your bike, it stays clean longer whenever you do that. As far as every day out riding about, there's you just want to make sure your bolts obviously are secure on the bike. Once it's cleaned, it starts getting into the tuning phase of it. Just any kind of Allen wrench. You can more or less build a bike with just some pretty basic tools. Allen wrench is the one you're going to use the most. Almost every bike on the bike, or every bolt on the bike, will be either a 4, 5, or 6 millimeter Allen wrench. In some cases, some of the older bikes have crankset bolts down here that'll use an 8 millimeter, but for the most part, you just have 3 tools really to use on an everyday basis. Good and bad to tightening versus over tightening. If you have any bikes that have carbon parts on them, I know Brian, you've got a lot of your carbon handlebars, stuff like that. If you over tighten up here at the handlebar stem, you can actually crush the carbon. It's made to take such clamping force, but not too much. So you just want to go through and make sure that it's snug but not over tightened. Handlebars, at the stem, brake bolts, and crank bolts are the ones that usually need some attention more often than others. And I'm just kind of rushing through this a little quick. I mostly meant to do some question and answer type stuff overall for the evening. All the threads on all the bolts as well, whenever you are tightening them, there's a difference between oil and grease between them. Your coarse thread bolts, like what you would find on your pedals, you want to put a thicker grease on whenever you're tightening stuff up. Fine thread bolts, like up in the handlebar stem, you just want to put a light oil on. I did bring out a couple of examples of the things between the oil and grease whenever you're going through and looping everything. Like this is a cable that I just found an old bike basically in the back that has more or less been abandoned. Someone didn't want to fix it. It had a lot of stuff wrong with it. So that's just a cable around a housing, not moving. You can kind of pass that around. That's pretty seized up. I mean, it'll work, but it's not going to work as good as something that's lubed up properly. And this is a cable. Once you actually, it should just fall like that. You shouldn't have to put a lot of friction on there. Another example here of cleaning the bike. A lot of people sweat more than others, so sodium buildup on aluminum. It can seize up things. This derailleur right here came off of a guy's bike. He's actually just in here looking at some shoes, and I was laughing. I said, I saved your, it's probably 5 years ago you replaced this. I don't know why I still have it, but it worked out good for tonight to show off. He sweats a lot, and just an aluminum part. Well, he didn't keep it clean. So to actually move this, you have to force it side to side. It just seized up. Whereas one that's working properly should just snap back into place. So if your cables are like that, and there's just multipliers, things that go in there. If your cables are seized up, if you have friction built up in your pivot points, like this thing here can't be fixed. Once the salt gets in there and it erodes and gets in the bushings, I mean, we lubed this thing, we boiled it in hot water, anything to try to break the sweat down, and it was just toast. You can't, I mean, you can fix them to a certain point, but after a while, they're just gone. Derailleur pulleys are another spot where you get some friction at. Back here as a chain runs through that. A lot of people overlook it. They don't see it as being a bearing that's in the bike, but it's just a bushing. But it still is a source of a lot of friction if it's not maintained properly. And this is not the pinnacle of technology for a derailleur. This is just a cheapie that I've gotten out of an old part somewhere. But the bottom pulley I have here, that's serviced right. And then I kind of exaggerated the calls of this right here. There's a lot of them that just seize up like this naturally. I had to make this one seize up just because I didn't want everybody to pass around a real greasy, nasty part. And you can kind of just spin those wheels right there and see the different amounts of friction that run through there. And same goes for the chain. The chain can actually be a source of friction if it's not cleaned and maintained properly. The difference between a clean chain and a dirty chain can be 3% actually power draw on the bike while you're pedaling it, and that's even more so than that. But if you take the wattage output of a rider, say 250 watts for an average, or maybe even a little bit above average rider to hold for a pretty steady basis, a dirty chain can cause you 7.5 watts, which is pretty noticeable whenever you're actually getting on there pedaling. So as far as key things that you want to keep oiled up, I would say clean and lube chain, any pivot points that revolve around the drivetrain, because this is where you're going to have most of your maintenance at, is around the drivetrain right there. Anything that moves while you're pedaling the bike, whether it be in the cogs right here you're passing around, the links in between the chain, as far as getting that cleaned out and relubed. You can't overlube a chain. You don't want too much on there. Whenever you take whatever you end up choosing to lube it with, I like the wet lube on it. It just depends on how often you maintain it. There's 3 different types of lubes. There's a wet, there's a dry, and there's a wax. And really it's just kind of what conditions you're riding in, and the name of the lube tells you what it's for. Wet lubes are for not dusty conditions where you have snow, water, mud. They protect the chain and don't gather a lot of dirt on it. And dry, dusty conditions, you want to use a dry lube. Now, dry loops take about 3 to 4 hours to dry once you put them on. So you have to do that in plenty of time before you go riding. You have to put it on and then wait for it to dry for it to actually work the way it's designed to work. Wax loops work like a wet loop does, but it has a wax layer that builds up over top of it. I don't like wax loops because they tend to leave your chain really, really dirty and gunk. Just a layer of dirt and gunk built up over top of it. They're meant to be cleaned before you re-wax them. Most people don't. They just keep applying it over there and it just builds up real thick. Which I think your bike had. Whenever I was working on it, I scraped a bunch of wax off the derailleur cogs that was built up on there just, I think, yesterday. So, I mean, I like the standard either wet or dry lube. I just avoid the wax for most people, unless you're really going to stay up on top of your maintaining your bike on a really, really regular basis. Like I say, I designed this to really be a lot more question and answer type stuff, so if anybody has anything they want to talk about. I'm not a good public speaking person, but I can answer questions like a champ.
Bikes with dissimilar materials like stainless steel bolts and titanium frames, you put grease on the bolts before you put them in on everything?
Yes and no. I use a anti-seize. Shimano makes a product called Lock Knot, and one bottle of it has literally lasted me over 10 years. I've had the same bottle of it. Just has a little paintbrush in it that you just paint onto the frames or onto the threads of the bolts. Typically, you see a lot of it with aluminum and titanium is where you see a lot of seized up problems. It's a problem called cold welding. It's just the metals of dissimilar properties fused together. But that's where you see it mostly at, is aluminum and titanium. Carbon fiber is another one. A lot of people think of just, well, put a layer of grease in it, especially on the seat post into the frame. You don't want to put grease on carbon fiber. There's actually a product called carbon paste, which is, it's kind of like an anti-seize, almost a sandy grit inside of it. It's made to reduce the clamping forces, so you don't have to damage your carbon parts. You can tighten them down without, and have the holding power without having to have the excess torque.
What kind of grease do you use on the wheel bearings, Ryan? Or how often should you disassemble the wheel bearings?
It depends on the type of wheel bearing. There's two different setups on it. The sealed cartridge bearings that some people pop the seals out on those, flush them, re-grease them. You can do that. Sealed cartridge bearings were ideally made for ease of swapping out. You just take a bearing remover, pop them out, pop a new one in, and it's already sealed, ready to go. But then some of them are like a much higher end, like a ceramic bearing. I know for guys, I have a Finish Line ceramic grease that I put in there, and you just got to put just the right amount. You don't want to overpack it or it'll start pushing the seals out. For regular wheel bearings, I just use a nice, just a part grease for non-ceramic stuff. It does high and low heats both, and it's very water resilient. Anywhere you're going to have a bearing on it, it's pretty well going to have some kind of a dust seal. Like these wheels right here have there's a seal onto the hub flange inside here, and there's a little rubber seal actually that keeps dust out on top of that. So it's a double sealed mechanism versus a sealed cartridge bearing.
What's that stuff you put on mine for the noise when you take it all apart?
Oh, like on what your seat post was?
No, yeah, that and on down for the suspension.
Oh, for that, you just use a standard grease.
Same stuff.
You want to use something a little bit heavier on things like that. Like what you had on yours was just basically a torque issue with the bolt, but it was a fine thread and it wasn't letting it torque tight enough.
Oh, okay.
Really, it was having a creaking noise. If bolts are too loose on a bike, you can get two different metals actually kind of rubbing together, just barely moving, but it makes a popping and creaking, crackling sound as you ride the bike, and it can be a booger to find, really. You can have a noise that sounds like it's coming out of here and coming out of the back end of the bike. The tubes on a lot of the modern bikes they're large diameter, hollow tubes, and noises travel and echo throughout the frame, and it can be difficult to pinpoint where noise is coming from. Usually you can find it, you have a pretty good idea of what it is, but I've had some take a little bit longer than others to find.
You were talking about cleaning your chain. You go ahead and use water and stuff, soap and water, and clean your chain.
I use a degreaser whenever I clean the chain off. Usually in the shop area, what I do, we actually have a parts cleaner, and we take the chain completely off the bike and have a solvent cleaner, and then we take an air compressor, blow all the solvent out, let it air dry. Usually pretty good while. We want to make sure it's good and dry and cleaned out before we're reapplying lube, because that solvent, if it's not all the way out, it'll actually act as a thinner and thin out the lube that we're trying to put on there.
But you don't want to do that very often.
It's like an oil change for your car. I mean, the cleaner and fresher it is, the happier it is.
Is that the best way to clean the chain, take it off?
Yeah, it's the best way to do it because you can scrub into it a little bit more in detail. Park does make a on-the-bike chain cleaner, the
Yeah.
Cyclone, and it wraps around the chain when you put it on there. And it actually has a series of brushes and sponges inside here that are supposed to get in there, and it does a pretty good job of cleaning it. It's just, if you're going to work on your bike and clean it, this is the very first thing you want to do because it will make a mess. And you need to clean everything else on top of it. There's a reservoir down in here where you put your cleaner, you run it through there, and then flush that out. And then you want to put some hot soapy water in there, and you probably run the chain through it 5 or 6 times after that before this water starts coming out or stops coming out black. You want it to come out pretty clean, or maybe just a real light gray. At a certain point, I mean, you can exhaust yourself trying to get the chain perfectly clean, because but getting the grease and dirt off the plates is not the problem. It's getting the dirt and grease out of the bushings in between around the pins is the thing that you'll almost never get out.
So that's a better one than the top one is?
What's that? This is a
That's
brush.
That's what I have. But it-
That's a brush that you dip down into a solvent, and then basically it's a similar thing without the actual solvent container being on there. It doesn't get in there quite as good as what that Cyclone does. But we actually take the, and I was showing Dan this before, we actually pop the chain off. Most of the chains on modern bikes anyway have a master link on them. Find it here. Here it is. And we'll actually just pop the chain off. And comes off easy as that, and you have your chain fully off the bike, and we just dip it down into the parts cleaner. We'll roll it up and scrub it on both sides and actually spray it out with a pressurized solvent and get out of everything in between the pins and bushings. And we'll let it hang like that and dry. Make sure all the solvent's off there, and then put the lube back on there and let it hang and in for quite a while before wiping off the excess. That's another thing on lubricants. You always want to wipe off any kind of excess that doesn't sling around on the bike. If it slings around, it's probably going to get back in this area, down on the bottom bracket. Difficult areas to clean, just because it's can't get in there real easy because you have the crank in the way. Without taking that off the bike, it can be a pain. There's brushes and everything for it, but it just never does quite as good as taking it all the way back apart. So you want to make sure the chain's pretty well dry before you put it back on. You don't want to sling stuff everywhere. It's going to create a lot of dust and or places for dust and dirt to stick on your bike.
That type of crank, is there anything you can do with those without bringing it to the shop?
Yes and no.
Yeah,
It does require, you can, but there's not a whole lot there to do it. Shimano does a really good job. They designed this crank set to be somewhat maintenance free. If the threads were looped good and it was torqued properly when you put the bearings in, it should be in there for quite some time before you have to do anything. The bearings that are actually inside here, like I said, they make something to service it. It's about popping the seals off of those cartridge bearings. But honestly, it's cheaper to replace them than the time and effort that you spend doing that. It's just as good to put a new set of bearings in, honestly. And that's part of the thing with sealed cartridge bearings versus the old loose balls. Is they're inexpensive and easy to replace. I think there's a few companies that still do strictly, and Shimano is one of them, that still strictly does loose ball bearings on the wheels. They do it because they have a special, what they call an angular contact on their thing. Instead of applying pressure straight side to side, Shimano applies it at 45-degree angles, so where it's never really side loading the bearing. So it rolls smooth and you can get good adjustment on it. Because with the sealed cartridge bearings, whenever you put a bearing in, unless it has a cone on it that adjusts the side load on it, which puts pressure on it and can tear the bearing up faster, they're really bearings in, that's how tight they are. I know a lot of the front wheels, back wheels, they just have plates that pop in. DT Swiss does it on their hubs. There's no adjusting to it. You put the bearing in, you put the hub caps in, and that's it. There is no adjustment above and beyond that. It was meant to be, they're trying to make it as low maintenance as possible. And that's what Shimano's done with like the new electronic shifting systems. They've made them to where they're a near zero maintenance system. That cable that I passed around, you know, you don't have that deterioration with the electronic shifting. There's no cable stretch, there's no outside contaminants that get down in the housing. The cable doesn't fray, the head doesn't break off of it. I mean, unless you bend your derailleur, there's really no adjustments that need to be made if everything's in aligned and in working order.
How long do batteries last?
Electronic shifting batteries typically last about 1,500 miles.
They give you warning before they go?
The front derailleur on the Shimano system will stop shifting before the back wheel as an indicator that it's going out. It takes 4 times the juice to shift the front derailleur than it does the back. So it's just set up toward this stops working before the back does. Some people get longer lifespan out of them that don't shift the front hardly ever, just stay in the big ring and just ride. You get longer battery life out of it.
They typically have a battery level indicator, don't they?
Yes, there's a battery level indicator on the front. You just hold in one of the shifting paddles on it for 2 or 3 seconds, and it'll either show up green or red where it needs to be charged. But it only takes 90 minutes from a dead stop, I mean, just a completely drained battery, to charge them back up.
Are they lithium ion or what kind of?
They are. And I haven't seen anything as far as a battery lifespan on those. They've been out for a while, and I don't know anybody that's had to replace any.
You referenced modern bikes. What's that mean? Like 2005 and beyond, or what?
Depends on really the price point of the bike. There are still bikes that use a square tapered crankset down here that have a fully internal bearing setup on it. I mean, we have bikes out there on the floor now that are doing it. But once really anything within the last few years, it's been at that about $800 price point and above. Usually has either a press fit bearing system or an external bearing like this does. And it's just the bolt style, the Allen bolt that actually fixes. See, this doesn't have an Allen bolt right there to fix it on. The spindle and this crank arm are all one piece, and then there's a fixing bolt on this side, and it uses a special Shimano tool basically to tighten down and preload the bearing, and then you torque the pinch bolts.
So is that harder to work on if you're just doing it yourself?
No, it actually is much less frustration getting these cranks apart than the old ones, because the old ones were a friction press fit. Depending on how tight they were, the spindles were actually tapered, and whenever that pressed on, there was no grease nobody put on them, because if you put grease, the friction fit didn't stay. These are splined, and they use a pinch bolt. It's much easier. You can just loosen 2 bolts, take the compression cap out, and the arm just slides completely off, instead of having to use a special remover tool that, in a lot of cases, would strip out if it was a real tight fit, you a lot of times strip out the crank arm trying to get it off. Then you had to get over ball joint car tool and potentially tear something up if you wanted to get it off, or cut it off.
Hello. Doing well, how are you?
They've gotten easier to work on in the last several years. There's
No, I
really
just got done with the
less
gym,
maintenance.
so-
Every year they try to get better and better as far as the less maintenance that you have to do to it. But until, bikes are still just a whole series of simple machines. You're always going to have friction with chains. You're always going to have friction on pulleys, cables. You're always going to have anything that's a cable-driven system like this. And you can pull this out right here. Of course, with the chain off of it, it's a little bit harder to do. You have access to lube the cables pretty easily. You pop them out of the holder right there, and you can actually just put the lube on it and pull them back up, and then you have a nice smooth shifting system again. But the liners inside the housing right there, this is a metal coil with a Teflon liner inside of it, and then after a while, that Teflon liner wears through, then you have metal on metal contact with your cable and housing, which is what happened to wherever it's at, that one back there. Versus I made a brand new cable set up this morning for that one, and it's got a coated cable with a brand new line housing on it, and it just is a lot smoother. There's a lot less friction on it. It's usually not the upshift that's ever a problem whenever the cables get like that. But generally, unless it's extremely severe, you'll still upshift to a higher gear. But the problem is whenever you downshift, the springs that pull the derailleurs back into its natural position aren't strong enough to overcome the friction that's in the cables. That's where you usually have the problem on shifting, is usually on the downshift.
Do you use a different lube on the cable housings, or?
I use the Triflow on the cable housing. I've used this for a long time. It's just a Teflon-based lube. It goes on wet, then it has a solvent in there that evaporates and leaves a Teflon coating on your cable.
How
Some
long
cables
do
are
the
good.
cables last?
Depends on how much you shift and the conditions you ride in. It's hard to put a time frame on a lot of things. Just like tires, tires can last. Some people will get 3,000 miles, 4,000 miles out of a tire, where another rider might only get 1,500 to 2,000 out of a tire. But if you have a 110-pound rider versus a 200-pound rider, then you got somebody that's riding on cleaner road. There's not as much glass, not as much sand, debris. I mean, that all makes a big difference on it. The majority of the rider's weight is over the back of the bike, so heavier riders definitely tend to wear out tires much faster.
Like for mine and his bike,
Mm-hmm.
how long should we put, before we put that in?
What,
The stuff you just.
like this right here? Every time you have your bikes in here, I always do that. That's one of the things I go over. I do it on my personal bikes. I'll probably do it once a month. But you just feel, whenever you're shifting the gears, you can feel it. It just takes a little bit more effort. I mean, it never hurts. You're not going to hurt anything putting it on there, as long as you don't have an excessive amount of oil just splashed all over the frame. If you wipe off any kind of excess, you can do it. You can do it once a week. I used to ride with a guy that he would take his chain off his bike, soak it, and clean it every single time that he rode the bike. Get the cleanest, shiniest chain I've ever seen in my life. But his chain it lasted forever. I mean, he got the most miles out of it because he kept it clean. That's all that stuff. Any kind of friction wears and tears on the drivetrain. A lot of people don't think about chains as being a wear item, but they are. The plates in between the pins stretch or lengthen, as they call it. And there's tools that go in there and actually show you how much it's stretched. This chain, obviously it's brand new, so it doesn't hardly move as far as the gauge. Some of them will come all the way over and do that, and then you still got blade side to side. And that's, whenever it gets that bad, that's when you're looking at, did I wait too long to replace my chain? Because the cogs wear to the chain. If the pins are on half-inch center-to-center spacing on all bikes, or most bikes actually, anything made anytime recently within the last 50 years are all half-inch spacing pin to pin. And once that lengthens, it'll actually start wearing in to where the cogs actually have like a shark fin shape to them instead of having the nice pointed tops to them. And the center of the grooves get stretched or worn on more than half-inch centers. When you put a new chain on there, it'll pop and skip and won't pedal. You're like, I just put a new chain on my bike. How come it worked better with the old one on there? So it will, because all your cogs are worn to the pattern of your old chain, and then you got to replace all of it. So, a new chain's always much cheaper than having to replace every cog on your bike.
When you take the chain off, does it have to go back on? Is it directional?
Some chains are directional, some aren't. Some of the newer Shimano chains are directional. Anything from the last 3 or 4 years, maybe even 5 years, that's either a Ultegra or Dura-Ace quality chain is usually directional. It has the instructions in the bag on the chains, if you ever put one on, how to cut it to the right length and which side faces in or out. The Shimano chains that are directional have a hollow plate on the inner plate and outer plate, and those face on the inside of the bikes. They use a full plate on the outside, because that's what rubs up against your cog when you're shifting up and make it more durable. But most chains aren't directional, just Shimano for the most part. If anybody was wanting to go over that I didn't talk about, or I did a poor job explaining on.
Our brakes,
Hydraulic disc.
yeah.
They're hydraulic disc brakes are run off of a sealed system.
So there's not much.
There's not, I mean, just like an automobile, hydraulic disc brakes on bikes, as you apply it, it actually generates heat and it goes up and builds up heat all the way throughout the housing and can actually get into it. Under heavy braking, you can, in some cases, even boil the
Yeah.
fluid inside there. And the fluid does need to be changed every couple of years on those. Like on your front brake.
Yeah.
Yeah, you actually had fluid build up in it. I had to drain some out yesterday. It happens though, it's not, I mean, the front brake's 80% of your stopping power on a bike. As you get on the brakes, all the way the bike goes forward, it unloads the back tire and the weight comes off of it, and it all concentrates down on a small patch about that big on the front of the bike. And that's where all your pressure goes. Everybody good?
Do you use a torque wrench, Ryan, when you put yours together? Have
Yes.
you done it long enough? You don't?
No, I still use a torque wrench. It's the torque wrench I have is a little torque key, so it's just it has interchangeable bits out on it, and you just put it in there and turn it and click it. I've got 3 or 4 torque wrenches, the big long ones, but the torque wrenches have gotten so much nicer now that it's about that big, and it's just on a little bitty Allen key, and you just twist it, and it's usually for your lower torque items, your 4 to 6 Newton meter torque items. So on cranksets, if you got the big torque wrench, anything that's usually 35 to 50 Newton meters of torque, we get out the bigger wrench, like on some of the cranksets. Everything's so light, fine thread, aluminum, you've got to be really, really careful not to over tighten any of the bolts. Because the aluminum can crush just as easy as the carbon can. Everything on the aluminum, you can sit here and grab this frame. It's so thin walled, so lightweight, you can press down on there and just with the reflection of the lights, I can see the flex in the material right there, and all bikes are like that. But they just make them so lightweight, so thin walled tubing now with the oversized shapes to make the bikes lightweight and ride good. You just gotta be careful not to tear them up over tightening things.
So you always use a seat post when you're putting them on your,
Depends on the thing. This is an aluminum seat post, so you can clamp down on it. Carbon frames, I have a dummy seat post that a lot of times I'll put in there. And then even some frames, you can't do that on at all. We've got a stand that clamps on, you take the front wheel out, and it's clamps onto there, so it actually doesn't touch anything on the frame or clamp down on it anywhere. I've seen people crack their frames, crack their seat posts just by putting it in a repair stand. Too tight.
that's mostly on carbon though.
Yes, almost always on carbon. I have seen somebody dimple an aluminum frame, clamping down on it. They got in there and wrapped it around their seat tube, which you should never do on any kind of frame. But they clamped down there on a real thin walled aluminum frame, and it actually crushed. It wasn't severe, but it was definitely, it's noticeable.
If you crack a carbon frame, anything you can do with it?
Yeah, actually there is. Carbon frames can be repaired easier than aluminum frames can. The aluminum frames, again, are so thin that you can't really re-weld them because it generates so much heat, it'll just melt it off.
Yeah.
Carbon, just lay it up like fiberglass, as long as you have this right kind of carbon and the layers are laid in the same direction. Most of the carbon frames now use a unidirectional carbon, but as long as you have a similar resin and someone that knows what they're doing.
Have you done that?
No, that's I'm not into carbon repair,
Yeah.
but there's a guy here in town that's done a few for me. that I've had him do, and there's a company that we've sent off to in the past that have done some carbon frame repair, and they do a really good job. But that's what they do. I don't do it on a regular enough basis to where it would be
That's probably not.
beneficial for me to. No, it's not. I mean, a lot of times, you know, but it's, if you have a $5,000 high-end carbon frame only that you broke, I mean, if it's gonna cost you $800 to have it fixed, it's a lot cheaper than buying a new frame. And with carbon repair, it's every bit as structurally sound as before the crash. And they've got such a good job of redoing the graphics and redoing the paint job on them. A lot of times you can't even tell that it was ever had anything wrong with it, which is good and bad. It's kind of scary if you're looking to buy a used item, you don't ever know if it's been,
Right.
it's never been broken or repaired, but they do a good job with them.
We were talking about those electric shifters, what do they work on? They have to be 10 speed and stuff, is that the only thing they're made for?
10 and 11,
10 and 11.
right now. I mean, there's some people that have gone in and hacked the firmware, and I mean, it's a computer. You can, I mean, ultimately anything's possible. There's guys that have done it. I am doing a project this winter for one on a recumbent, doing a rear electric shift on a long wheelbase. But
9 speed, I'm assuming.
10.
Oh, it's a 10,
Yeah,
okay.
it'll be a 3x10 setup on it. The front shifter is going to be regular, and the back one's going to be push button electronic. We'll just use one of the climbing shifter sets, just one of the toggle switches out there on the handlebar, and you'll have an up and down shift on one side, and you'll have your twist grip on the other for the front and rear. With the old stuff, you couldn't do that, but they've gotten to the point now with the electric shift that you can kind of run a single item on it instead of having to run the whole system as one. You used to have a closed loop, and you have to have everything plugged in and everything on the original stuff. The newer stuff now has got where you can just have one item in, have the battery, have the shifter head on there, and it all works. But it's interesting. You're going to start seeing, I mean, that stuff's amazingly waterproof. It's durable. There's cyclocross racing with it. You'll start seeing mountain bikes have electric shift on them. Probably 1 to 2 years. There's kits out there, you can do it, you can build your own, but you can probably start seeing production stuff in the next couple of years. Same thing with disc brakes on road bikes. You're going to start seeing that more and more. You've seen a little bit of it out now, but until UCI legalizes it to actually be raced with, you won't see it go mainstream, because none of the companies are going to put their pros on a bike that you can't buy. Or they're not going to have them.
They're an advantage for touring.
Oh, yeah, definitely you can. You don't have the heat buildup in the braking service.
Do the electric shifters shift as quick as the
Yes,
manual, or
Yep.
whatever you want to call it?
they do. And you can actually turn up or turn down how fast they shift. We have, we're fully Shimano certified for cable and electronic shift systems. We have their diagnostics box and their diagnostic software. So we can plug your electric shift bike up into a laptop, and I can change what every single button does. You can change the shift speed. You can make them sequential. You can do tons of stuff with the electric shift. But it's, you know, you work on a bike with a laptop now.
Cool.
Yeah. It's pretty neat. We had, I've only had one electric shift bike that actually had an electronic little gremlin that wasn't showing up on the diagnostic software. And after replacing piece by piece, we found out it was a bad battery mount. But I've done, I don't know how many electric shift systems, and that's the only one that I've ever had a problem. And Shimano's good about it. You know, they're great about replacing it. They took care of, by any means necessary, making sure it was right. But it was just on that particular case, it was kind of a trial and error thing because it wasn't showing up on the diagnostic system what was wrong with it. So you had to go through and just do piece by piece by piece until you got there. We good? Can answer questions online. Good deal. I think Angela had some giveaways, some drawings. What you got there, Angela?
We had church, unless you had anything from the department today.
They have different sizes in the back though. I
Yeah.
just have these out.
The bike would be nice.
I'll make your size.
I'd sell it.
I thought you can give away free samples of the park tools.
Park tools, no. One thing, I've got to do on the, also that would be good on, it's not work on all bikes, but like it would work on yours, the chain catchers that go down there. It keeps the chain from dropping off down past the small cog onto your frame. It doesn't work on all bikes, it's made for bikes that have a certain type of frame really.
I've never had mine come off on that direction.
Yeah.
I've had it pop off
Pop,
on the
go
other side
over.
and just shift and put it back.
Usually what
on.
happens whenever they pop off is the set screws, they can back out, but a lot of times, like on this derailleur, you've got a steel screw in there, and then it's a softer aluminum plate that actually pushes up against it, and it'll actually hit it so many times that the metal will dimple in a little bit and let it overshift. It's not super common, but it does happen on occasion. It's, you know, a little small adjustment on there takes care of it.
I learn something new every day too. I'll let you draw.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna do two.
Roger.
What size shirt do you normally wear?
Large.
Okay.
And Chloe.
I don't know if I have any small enough for you. I can give you the smallest I have.
I think she wears a small in youth.
Okay, I can do this one here, or also you can give one to somebody in the family too. It's up to you.
That's small.
This is small, yeah. It'd be a cute night shirt, you know. Gotta have legends on it.
Play hide and go seek it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the back. If you need to change that, just let me know.
Yeah.
Any other
The
questions?
stickers.
Feels long so you stick your hands out.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Come see me in my office too. I have something else in there I think of that you would like better. So you can pass that one along. Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate the community support and stuff, and being able to do free events like this mean a lot to us just because our whole goal is to get people active. So as cheesy as that may sound, like we really do appreciate it because this is cool for us.
Very good. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.